Hello, welcome back to The Cave Escape. I'm Caleb Groves.
And I'm Ashton Goolsby.
And today we're going to be talking about the next part of the liberal arts tradition by Kevin Clark and Ravi Scott Jain. And last week we talked about piety and gymnastics, I believe, right? Was that what the part was called?
It was
Piety and poetics.
It was like music and gymnastics, and they're fundamental into moving to the next arts afterward.
Right. You need those as the foundation because they kind of teach you piety.
Yeah.
Which we went into. But then also music and gymnastics kind of teach you some of the imitative aspects of connecting with the physical and spiritual world. Mm-hmm. Might be a super kind of possibly vague summation of what that was.
Yeah. If you want to learn more about that, I'd recommend going back and listening to that episode again. But this time we're moving kind of back to something we've sort of already talked about in episode 1 of the podcast. But it's kind of like exploring something from a different side, and in some ways, even with our conversation with Mr. Wilbur, some of our understanding of it has changed slightly, or the way we would describe it now. It's almost like we've got maybe better terminology to define it with, as well as
the thing being the Trivium specifically.
Oh yes, I guess we should say that.
Yes, because the next part of the book is the liberal arts, and today we're going to talk about the Trivium. Next week we'll talk about the Quadrivium. But yeah, like Ashton said, it's kind of sort of like a rehash, but not even quite that. It's because it's like a rehash, but there's lots of new seasonings in it, and it tastes way different now. So when I said hash, my mind went to hash browns. That's why I went with that analogy. Was there anything new in like the intro where he just talked about the liberal arts by themselves, like as a whole? Was there anything like new and interesting in that section that you found that we hadn't really talked about before?
Well, I liked, and this was something Mr. Wilbur told us too. I think he probably mentioned it in episode 3, the second one we did with him. But the idea of Dorothy Sayers presents them as tools of learning to just indefinitely learn, but approaching them here, as Mr. Wilbur also said, as they're the language arts. So it's you're learning how to use language well, rather than just learning tools to go learn things too. They even kind of get into the idea of, whereas before initially we presented grammar as Sayers said, as you are learning the terms of a language. They don't really have that idea as much in here.
Mm-hmm. They do, but it's a little bit.
Yeah, it's different.
With like a different intention and different kind of underlying purpose.
Yeah, but even there, they look at it more as grammar is you're studying the basics of language, but as you study language itself, you're opening the mind to think at increasingly higher levels, almost. Right.
You're not merely, now we're just already talking about grammar by itself rather than the liberal arts as a whole. But yeah, like a kind of like, rather than just rote memorization of facts, which like is part of it, but it's, you just like read poetry and you just read literature, and then that teaches you how those things work, which then gives you kind of an intuitive sense of how language operates. And then once you like, it begins with the imitation, and then you go and you learn more of the rules of like syntax and actual like grammar of how language works specifically, technically, kind of in the latter half of the grammar education. It's kind of how they phrased that part.
But I even like from the get-go, which is taking a step back for a second, because he talks about the idea of arts, and I really like the way they define the arts. He says, an art is the nexus between imitation and science, the former being only in the body and the latter being only in the mind. And then he says, an art must be the well-ingrained imitative habit honed by its accompanying science. So it's the way I understood it is more of going through the Trivium is more building the student up in habits, that they increasingly they grow these habits to form the person, body and soul, like we were talking about with the music aspect and the gymnastic aspect, where the body and soul were a combination of both. So you're training you're training their soul habitually through these things to align with what is true and how to reason through what is good and true and beautiful. And so it's not so much of a utilitarian practical. The kids can believe in. They're just going to know how to do these things and they know how to attack certain subjects certain ways. They can do that, but the point of it is more internally what's happening to them spiritually, building them up to love what's good, true, and beautiful, and recognize it and find. I mean, I would think ultimately find peace and rest.
Yeah.
In that, which as Christians we would say is finding rest in God Himself, because He is truth, beauty, and goodness.
Yeah. Right. I also thought it was the way when he talked about he described the arts as being a kind of work that is used to compile and justify the speculative sciences. And so it's kind of like these are like the arts that are used when studying the merely speculative sciences that are just like the reason alone. It's not like the art, which is imitation and reason, right? And then he went in and talked about like the justification for a given thing needing to be appropriate for the art that it falls into. Kind of, and like, this is kind of, I don't know if I've said this in a confusing way, but he talked about like you wouldn't require mathematical certainty in rhetoric. Like when in giving a speech and like a rhetorical speech, obviously there are like technical reports that you can give orally that need to be statistical and stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's more like in a more general persuasive rhetorical speech, you have more like probable certainty.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't require mathematical certainty because that would kind of be silly. Just like you wouldn't require, what was the other example he had? You wouldn't require a justification of war from geometry.
Yeah.
Like, so like there's like different levels. And this is one of the things we talked about in Harmonia today in class. Mr. Wilbur said that we're so used to quantifying things that we don't really know how to qualify things. And the way that I understood that kind of in relation to this was almost kind of the difference that they go on to talk about later between like intellectus and ratio, being like intuition versus reason.
Yeah.
Right. And like we just with post-enlightenment, I guess, kind of thought and like with like the modern emphasis on reason, right? We want everything to be numbers. And he quoted somebody else too and said something about like we forget that measuring the universe is, well, okay, that wasn't exactly how the quote started, but something about measuring the universe as like how many feet does the universe extend versus measuring the universe by what is the relationship between like the different planets and like the different parts of the universe and kind of like measurement, and not as much of a quantifying measurement, but like a qualifying type of measurement.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think too of the way he argues quite passionately sometimes. The idea of, yeah, okay, we all know, thanks Copernicus, that the sun really is the center, but the argument he makes for still it's a geocentric universe, because mathematically and scientifically we understand we go around the sun, not the other way around.
Right.
But as Christians understanding that we're image bearers of God, created in His image, no other creature has that. We've been placed in dominion over it. Creation is made in a sense to serve us. Mm-hmm. So if you
like
think
the sun
about,
serves the earth, kind of idea.
But you even got like the earth is positioned perfectly from the sun. It's not too close, not too far. But then you've got the other planets, asteroid belts, and things that constantly are protecting us from meteors or other things that might want to harm us, protecting us and examining that type of order. There's a way of that's important to understand too. The ancient way is a much more beautiful way of understanding God's bounty and His gifts in protecting us and caring for us. Versus if we just put it in terms of, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, the sun is in the center. We know it's not the earth. There's a different mindset of, the literal center, yes, we know is the sun. But the center is in the focal point is earth where God's image dwells.
Right.
So kind of having, is it the same thing as quantifying, qualifying?
I think so, yeah, kind of. But also, I want to kind of clarify something that you were just saying. In saying that, like, the way the ancients viewed the universe was just, like, a much better, more beautiful way of doing it. That's not to write off the modern, like, scientific understanding either.
Yeah.
And, like, in the same way that we don't want to go, oh, well, that's stupid. Obviously, the Earth goes around the sun. We don't want to go, oh, well, that's stupid. Obviously, the sun serves the Earth. And we should just kind of completely disregard the actual math of the universe.
Yeah.
So, like, you hold both of them in there. And I don't think that, like, they're mutually exclusive. And I think it's important to hold both of those together because I think that they're mutually informative rather than exclusive.
Yeah.
But then the way that relates back to what I was saying before is, like, the requiring you using the right tools to justify a given thing or concept. And so, like I said, like, you wouldn't use geometry to justify war. And so in the same way, there are certain things, like, there is some knowledge kind of, this is one of the things that we've talked about in Harmonia that I don't still entirely understand. But, like, some knowledge that can't actually really be expressed with words. And it's expressed with music, and it can be expressed with other things too. But it's like this kind of, like, subconscious. It's probably something to do with the transcendentals, I guess, but I really don't understand the transcendentals.
They transcend us.
Right. I know that much. But something like subconscious truth that we just, like, know, but that we can't actually, like, we don't, like, consciously know. And it's not something that we can actually express with words. And it's really hard for us with our modern minds to, like, accept, even more than just comprehend, but, like, accept that there is some kind of knowledge that cannot be described with words. Or like that can't be explained.
Yeah.
With actual language. And because we're trying to quantify everything, we need everything to, like, fit into, here are the words that describe this idea and this concept and this knowledge. And part of that just comes from, like, our understanding of what knowledge is. Because we've lost the intellectus. We've lost the intuitive knowledge, the intuitive understanding of, like, there's some knowledge that's intuitive and there's some knowledge that's reasonable or, like, rational.
Yeah.
And the difference there, because we've made intellectual and rational the same word, which we can get to that, I guess, when we get there. But
well, I was gonna say, I think some of this feeds into the discussion of the grammar stage too, where you've got because I know we've talked about this, the idea of the grammar being looking at more like the words and the fundamentals of language itself, and the idea of to be able to express something in language gives you almost like an understanding of it. So I love my dad talks about this all the time because he actually heard him give this speech at a new
Who's
college.
he?
The author.
Oh, crazy.
I believe it was him. Oh, no, sorry, it was Andrew Kern actually.
Okay.
But it was I thought for some reason he wrote this. Anyway, he was at a student weekend talking about the idea of a child learning. He said there's so much that goes into a child learning to speak his first words. If you think about it, it's easy to learn something like Latin or Spanish or Greek or whatever you want once you know English. So I know English and I can think of things because I know the words for them, but a little kid doesn't know. And it has to start off and learn, that's mom, that's dad, this is something else. And it starts to learn things and then relationships between them, and it starts learning words out of context. And he said it's really a miracle that by the age of 1, a kid can understand language and is starting to speak it back. There's so much work that has to go into it. But like you were talking about, like the intellectus and trying to quantify things as words, I think that's what we're created to want to do. Because, I mean, if you think God created things by his word, Christ is the word.
Yeah.
So, I mean, grammar as a study of just words and just language itself, to be able to put it in words gives you a new understanding of it. Like we've talked about in Greek, you've got present, past, future, but you've also got this idea of in the past, you've got the imperfect and then the perfect that we have in English, but then they've got aorist, which is something we don't have. But if you read Greek understanding what the aorist tense is, it changes the reading of it.
Right.
Or even like I was saying with like Anglo-Saxon, they only had 2 verb tenses. So their concept of the future was almost like one of the present.
Yeah,
so,
that's crazy.
So really here with their I love the way they put it out the grammar. It's not just learning a bunch of facts about just different subjects. It can be that, and there's a level to which it is that, but not quite the way Sayers said. It's more of you're just learning the reason of just things. You're just learning to think about them, basically.
Yeah.
You're being introduced to how can I discuss this thing and understanding it.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting, too, when they said, one need only consider what a reader should know in order to interpret properly the Aeneid, and he or she will understand intuitively the nature of grammar in its full-orbed classical sense. And so that was kind of wild.
Can you help me? I was a little bit confused as to what he meant by that. I think I get it, but I was a little confused by what he was trying to say there.
I understood that as being like, so it's like down at the bottom of the page. I'll just read that. So there's a brief historical sketch reinforces the claim made at the beginning of this chapter, namely that the grammar of grammar has never meant to learn the rudiments of all the subjects. Rather, it means learning to read and to write, to hear and to speak Latin and later Greek, and it means gaining a knowledge of the history, literature, and even geography necessary for understanding in octer. Which they didn't really give us a definition of octer.
I think he said it basically just means author is like the Latin term. It means something a little bit different, but it basically means author, okay. I believe is what he said.
Yeah, and he's kind of specifically referring to like the great philosophers and stuff, kind of, right?
He also further down here says author, or it can also take the context of authority on the subject.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and so if you're reading Plato, if you're like Plato's Republic, for example, I haven't actually read that because I didn't take that class, but I know generally like how it works, and like you would, to fully understand that work, you would need to understand the geography of ancient Greece at the time and kind of like the political situation of like of Athens and like other cities around there. And if you don't understand what that's like, then you're not going to understand fully what Plato means when he says certain things in the Republic. And if you don't understand like the language that he uses, or kind of like the philosophical context, and like even the history up to that point, like the history, like whatever wars have happened in Greece and the surrounding areas, the more of all of those things you understand, the more you'll be able to understand the language of the work and the literature that you're reading, because you understand it in the context in which it was written.
Yeah.
Which I think kind of plays into something they mentioned later, which is a big idea in Charlotte Mason's work, which is the difference between sympathetic and analytical learning. And being like, modern education emphasizes analytical learning almost entirely, like exclusively. And you read the Iliad, and as you read it, you pick apart each line and you like dissect the lines and you analyze the line, rather than learning it sympathetically, which is like as a whole, and taking the Iliad as an epic poem and reading it like out loud. I would say probably would be a part of that, because actually that's just in the original Greek. You don't need to read the Iliad out loud in English. But reading it as a whole and understanding what the story is and the general themes in it, and even like more specific things, and like you can look at specific images and things, but you understand how they fit into the larger context. And then once you understand what the thing is and what it actually is saying, then you can analyze it. And you can, and like with like other works, you can like, once you understand what a philosopher is actually saying, it's not until you actually fully understand that and that you can then analyze it and decide if it's correct or incorrect, or if you agree with it or disagree with it.
So it's that if you have to understand what he's saying before you can then critique and analyze it.
Yeah.
You have to have a big picture before you can then. That's why it's important to read things multiple times, I guess.
Yeah.
Read it, get the big picture, and then go back through it line by line and analyze it first.
I bet I haven't read C.S. Lewis's Experiment in Criticism, but I bet he talks about that in that
It's been a while since I read it. I think he does.
I would be very surprised if he didn't talk about that.
He talks about the idea of receiving something, rather than sitting down and I can't remember the exact words he used, but receiving what they're saying. So just sit down and read it and just listen to what they're saying, but don't immediately start fighting with it.
Yeah.
So he said a lot of times we tend to sit down and go, and even underlining, and I've noticed since reading it, the way I take notes and things has changed. Instead of sitting down with something, well, point A, I disagree with there. Okay, point B, I'll agree with a little bit. Marking points, he said, just read it and engage with it and just listen to what they're saying. Mm-hmm. Then once you have heard what they're saying, and I guess this is the point we're talking about. Once you've heard what they're saying, then you can go back and critique it. But he said initially just listen to it.
Yeah.
Listen to it, receive it. And also the idea of listening to it and receiving it but not using it. Because we do that with scripture all the time. We take it and we pull verses. Well, this makes my point. Well, this makes my point. Don't use it that way. Listen to what's actually being said. Mm-hmm. I believe that was his basic point. Like I said, it's been a few years since I've read it. I have to go back and read it again. But
so I just want to read this last little something towards the end of the grammar section when he says, so this is speaking about the imitation that like a child learns to speak by imitating what she hears from her parents. Also like rhymes, poems, songs, and passages of literature that are learned by rote. The purpose of such imitation is assimilation. That is, for the rhythms and cadences of language to work their way firmly into the child's memory. Over time, students will gain an intuitive appreciation for proper speech and expression, which will enable them to confidently judge whether something sounds right, regardless of whether or not they know why this is the case. And that kind of goes back to like there's like the basis of that intuitive knowledge. That was so like so for example, when I took the ACT for the first time, I didn't actually really study for it at all because I just didn't do it. But I did not expect to do well in the reading section because I thought I didn't read well. I didn't really write well. I was like, I don't really know grammar very much. I read really slow. But the grammar and English sections were actually my highest scoring things. And I scored like 31 or 32 or something in the reading section. Or maybe it was even... No, it wasn't English. But like I did really well in the English and reading section. And it was because... It wasn't because I would see a sentence and be like, no, that should be a semicolon instead of a comma because of this kind of a phrase, and you have this little, I don't really still know grammar words, so I'm not going to try and say any. But like I just like would see them and be like, that looks like it's wrong. This one looks like it's right. And it's because I'd read so much. Like all of my schooling for like my whole life was just reading. And so I just kind of intuitively knew what kinds of sentences were structured correctly and what kinds weren't. Mm-hmm. Without actually knowing the reasons why.
Yeah. Well, I've had a conversation like that with some of the parents of some of my students. Because it's one of those, like fourth grade, they should know how to spell, but it's also that where some of them still don't. And so I had a couple parents that were concerned, is my daughter's having trouble spelling things. Is that normal? And the thing I told them, which is something that, I mean, we noticed the same thing at our house growing up. The more we read, because my spelling was atrocious, but the more I read, the better my spelling got and grammar. And I was actually just talking with my mom about this Saturday. She was noting one of my brothers, a paper he wrote recently, having some grammatical problems with it. And she said, it's funny because me and the sister right after me, we both took writing classes for a few years in middle school. And then none of my other siblings did. But then my next sister down and then my next brother, they just read all the time. And so when they wrote, they know how to tie ideas across sentences, how to have a flow of a paper. And just by the fact that they read so much, that kind of just developed and they were able to do it. But then my next brother down he's more athletic. He reads some, but he reads slower. He doesn't read as much. But noticing his writing, because he doesn't read as much, is kind of not maybe where it should be in some places.
Yeah, but then also specifically, that's just like the beginning portion of the grammar section too. So like you do that, But then in the latter half, then you get into more of this is actually how this works, and these are the rules for like this sort of a thing. And so you kind of, you begin with all of these, because like the way they describe art is like imitation joined with reason or understanding, right? And so all of them start with imitation. And that you begin with imitation, and then from once you've like internalized it and it's become kind of intuitive, then you start moving towards understanding how it actually works, which I think is super cool, and actually is like exactly how humans learn stuff. And
well, it's like you see a kid, they have the mannerisms of their parents,
right?
Because how they're learning to interact with the world, they're learning to do it interacting with the people that are in their life, which at this point is their parents. I think I even told you, I noticed at one point, because I'm naturally very introverted, but when I started working customer service at Chick-fil-A, I had to obviously learn how to talk to people and not be just weird. And so I had a friend who was very extroverted, and if I got in a situation, I would think, oh, what would Nolan do? And so I would just start emulating him. And then,
interesting. Wow.
And then I noticed at New College, I kind of continued doing that, but when I met Josiah and I started hanging out with him more, I kind of tweaked it, and it ended up, I kind of combined the two at one point, and I noticed if I got in a weird social situation, I would just revert to like a mix of Josiah and this guy I used to work with.
Fascinating.
So, wow. But that idea of you learn how to do things by copying somebody else, and then at some point you can just kind of do it yourself without thinking. But for the longest time, I literally would think, what would he do in this situation, and I just had to copy it because I didn't know what else to do. Wow. And then eventually you can kind of take ownership of it. But I liked their phrasing of the grammar stage here, not as just you're just teaching them facts and just the basic things, but you're teaching them imitation of things. So they're not worried about the understanding of it so much yet, or the wrestling with it as much as they are getting you in the habit of these things right here. You're seeing this is what language
and it's also
looks like.
This is the one that teaches authority, right? Like it, I think right there at the end.
Yeah. Well, that was the part we just looked at.
Okay, yeah. Where like it answers the question, whom do I trust?
Yes.
Because it kind of gives you these are the people who are reliable, and these are the works. You kind of become familiar with the works that they've written, and you learn these are the things that like these people talk about actual truth. And then once you get to like the more like the dialectic stage, which we should probably move on to, and then like also the rhetoric stage, like you know, okay, this person is a reliable thing, but I'm still going to think through their arguments and like practice the art of the dialectic or logic, which I like their use of dialectic better once they kind of explain that. That made a lot more sense. But you're using that art to kind of work through their argument, but you're still like, I know this is an example of like something that's good and points to truth. And so then you have that you can study to then see the counterfeit. Like people who's like find counterfeit money, they just handle real money all the time. And then they can feel when it's fake money just by touching it because they handle the real stuff all the time.
I like that too, where the way he ended it with the idea of learning who to trust. So it's not just that blanket, I'm giving you facts, just believe them, which is more of what modern education tries to do. Is these are facts, they're infallible, you must take them.
We can prove them with numbers.
Yes, but teaching the children, these are the things to trust. You can trust, and they themselves get a feel for what is true and trustworthy and what is not. So it's not just, you have to trust me because I say so. They get this sense, of, yeah, this is trustworthy, this is not.
Which is very helpful for kids because they don't know how to think about stuff.
Yeah.
And they need some kind of, I don't remember, we might have talked about this last time. Did we talk about like the idea of like the dangers of like ultra individualization of children before they've been educated, and the need for authority figures, and how that's not brainwashy?
I don't think that was last time.
Okay, I talked about this with somebody recently. And I have to explain everything I just referenced. But like so like I feel like a lot of kind of like the way that the modern world works is like everybody needs, like there's a huge emphasis on individualism. And everybody's their own individual, and you need to be able to think for yourself and decide things for yourself. which kind of like ends up going into like finding your own truth and stuff like that. But like even kids, like we give kids all these decisions to be making because we want kids to be their own people, and like we have like we're just gonna give them the facts and then they get to like work through the facts themselves and decide if it's true or not, which really modern education doesn't do that. They're just like feeding them the facts that they want to feed them and saying that they're true. But it's important for kids to have an authority figure who says, this is what's true, this is what's not true. This thing is correct and this is incorrect. And teaching them, because truth is objective. And so is objective. And so they need to be taught what the truth is so that they can know, they can then find for themselves what is true and not true once they've like moved on past that stage. But they have to be taught at some point because they don't know how to do it like by themselves. If you just like throw a kid into the world and be like, now go make all these decisions and like try and discern the good from the bad and the true from the untrue, they don't have anything to work from because you haven't taught them anything and they've had no authority figure. And so, and I could see how somebody could see that as being kind of brainwashy. I mean, like, oh, well, like, who are you to decide what are the objective truths that need to be taught to kids? And I mean, I guess you point to like the philosophers and stuff, because I would say that they have the more like objective truth types. I mean, obviously they weren't infallible, and a lot of what they said is like wrong and just doesn't make any sense with what we know now. But like, there's still, I don't know how to like quantifiably explain how we know what objective truths are, but I also don't think that we need to quantifiably explain what they are. To go back to what we were talking about before, like to quantify objective truth doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah.
But that's what people want, because that's the only way that people nowadays know how to decide if something's true. Like if something works and it like, if the math is solid, then it's true.
Well, it's literally the scientific definition of truth.
Right. Yeah. And so, but that's the only way that people can conceive of truth. And then any other conception of truth is completely subjective. And we've lost this like other, I don't even know how to talk about it really, because I'm still learning about it. So that just is something that we can continue to learn about, I think, and figure out exactly how it works. But
yeah. But it would even go back to your point of the idea of leading them to find what is true and trustworthy. I've noticed with my class, which is fourth grade, so they're like 9, 10, they very much want somebody to tell them what is true, what is not true. And so they come to you, is this true? And so you also have to help them see the side of, this is not so much a hard and fast good or bad, true or false situation. So helping them to see that, but also a thing that the headmaster encourages us in meetings, but especially beginning of the year, is your job is to, in a lot of cases, you're supposed to lead them to discovery. So rather than just, it's not a indoctrinating of this is true and this is not. You are, I mean, because we're a Christian school coming from a Christian perspective,
right? We
hold that these certain things in Scripture these are the true things, but leading them to it, and you know what the answer is, and you don't just give it to them. You kind of nudge them over until they find it, go, hey, and then they think it's theirs and they take ownership of it. And so for them, they're learning it, but it's more of you guiding them and saying, hey, why don't you look over there, and they find it. Because I even notice there's that, like, talking again here, the training the habits and I think that was what he said at the beginning, right? Training habits.
Yeah, I think so.
He talked about that somewhere. But I've noticed in reading things with them, and I was actually just talking, I think, to the headmaster about this the other day. I said, I've noticed them picking up on connections across books and things, like symbolism through Scripture. They'll pick up on, hey, this story sounds like a story back with Abraham, and continuing, and then we'll be reading something in literature, and they'll go, this reminds me of the story of Joseph. I'm like, yes, it does. Or then in history, well, this kind of sounds like the same things the Egyptians were doing at this time in Exodus. I mean, yes, it does. But getting them, I know where we're going with it. But it's so fun when they make the point before I can even ask the question sometimes. And I think that's more the point of the grammar stage, is teaching them to recognize true, false, but on their own, not because I'm telling them no, you must believe this is true, but because they see it and are learning to trust.
Yes.
That I trust this source is true. I don't trust that one as much. Whereas I feel like the more secular mindset is, we're taking them, no, you must believe this because it's this thing and this thing is true, and we trust this thing. You must trust it. Mm-hmm. And the kid's just like, well, I guess I must trust it because he told me I have to. Instead, we as Christians and classical educators would rather themselves learn to just see this thing just is trustworthy, and have them see it themselves.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think, I know people that would disagree that like modern education entirely does that. And I could definitely see an argument being made that
I'm thinking like, more public school education.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know as much about public school in general, and but I think I can see an argument being made that modern education actually does that more than we do, because they don't actually believe in objective truth. I mean, that wouldn't be the reasoning there, but like that they encourage free thinking more, and like individual reason, and getting like deciding, like just trying to give objective facts and then allow each individual to work through the facts and decide if like what the true conclusions are.
Yeah.
I think is something that people would definitely say is a huge thing in like modern education. And I don't think that they're doing that in public schools necessarily. I definitely think that public schools are an indoctrination kind of a thing. I don't know about at the college level. It's kind of a different thing, but yeah, but we should probably move on to the dialectic stage, which actually kind of flows, it segues very nicely.
Yes.
Because that's when you start actually working through arguments and figuring out, it's more than just, that's why I like dialectic better than logic, because logic makes it sound like, oh, we're just going to learn all these fallacies and how to tell if sentences are like logically valid or not. Whereas the dialectic is like how to actually like work through the reasoning behind the words, almost kind of. And like it comes from like dialectic dialogue.
Yeah. Well, I actually had that note, and that was what I was actually about to say.
Yeah, go ahead and say it.
You've got the grammar, because most of what I do with my students is I have a question. Can you tell me why what I've said is true, or what the right answer is, or why it's wrong? Can you correct me on okay, it's very much raise your hand. Logic being more of, it's a discussion, or sorry, dialectic rather. Dorothy Sayers called this section logic.
Right.
They reverted back to the other word for it was dialectic. But the dialectic has more of that idea of you're dialoguing with somebody. It's a back and forth, a give and a take.
Yeah.
Rather than just a point by point by point, right, wrong, right, wrong, right, wrong. You're taking these talking points that you've kind of gone over in grammar, and you're having more of a back and forth with somebody else about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, who was it? Was it?
And you're learning, he says, to ask the right questions.
Yeah, I really like that the emphasis is on asking the right questions rather than having the right answers. Because that kind of, I think, kind of comes from the similar idea. They might have actually go on to talk about this in this section. I don't remember what the section was where they talked about the sympathetic and analytical thing. But like asking the right questions is trying to understand what the thing is what the thing actually is. Yeah. But if you're just trying to have the right answers, you're already analyzing and making a judgment on it before you've asked questions about what it is. So I just thought that was super helpful. Yeah. And we might speak of dialectic as the art of following the question.
Oh yeah, I
referring
really like that.
To Socrates, kind of like showing all of his disciples and students that he talks to, like, see how this question follows naturally from this question that I just asked, and it like follows directly into this next question. And like you just kind of like asking the right questions will naturally lead you to other right questions, which will ultimately lead you to an understanding of the thing that you're studying.
Which that was an interesting thing for me, encountering Socratic discussion, because it's one of those where I can't think of a better way to learn something.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
it's weird because you think, well, we're so used to the idea of grab a textbook and read it, and now you understand it and you learn it and you know it.
You just kind of avoid all of the wrong ideas, and you're just
Yeah.
given all of the correct ideas right there in a concise form.
Yeah, but then with discussion, or as we call it sometimes, Socratic discussion based off of the style of Socrates, his dialogues just start with a question. He's got a question that he wants
Right.
answered, and he's just breaking it down into smaller sub-questions. Can it be this? Well, no, we can't say it's that. Well, okay, then if we can't say that, then we have to pose this other question to it.
Right.
So it's basically it's like you start with a question, and you learn to, like we're saying, follow the question, but you kind of have other questions off of it, and you just kind of dance around it and try to find an outline of what it is, and you just try to hone in more and get more specific as you go.
And you say a lot of things that are wrong,
Yeah.
but then you realize that they're wrong, and then now you know that's wrong, and you move on to like this next thing, and either this thing is right, or you just ask this new question. You're like, oh no, that's actually also wrong, and then you move on.
It's kind of like, I think of it like echolocation, where like you send out a sound and something bounces back, and if nothing bounces back, then you know there's nothing there. You turn a different direction. If something bounces back, you eventually start getting kind of pings on it, like a radar.
Huh? I
And
like
they
that.
kinda
That's
outline
cool.
it
I've
that way.
never thought of it that way.
I also like it where he's talking about development from small children up to more this stage. He says you move from small conversation like, did you have a good day? Asks the parent. Yes, I did, thank you, responds the child. But as the student matures, the art expands. Salvete discipuli, a teacher says to her Latin students as she enters the classroom. Salve, domina, the students reply in return. This time it's not simply good manners and polite speech that are being taught. They're being taught dialectically. So they're not just being taught good manners, they're being taught how to have a back and forth. So there's the simple of a child back and forth with their parent. Did you have a good day? Yes. But now they're learning, the teacher says something to them, there's a response there to have back to it. And to me, that almost, it hit me almost like a liturgy. Like learning to, because the idea of liturgy is ordering. Well, we usually think of it in the context of worship.
Right.
The words that are said and the things that are done.
Yeah.
But it's not meant to be in a mundane sense, but in a sense of restfulness. The children are learning how to just discuss and have dialogue, but it's not it's not done in a exhaustive, cumbersome, I have to look smart and I have to always constantly be on my toes going. It's just it's a thing that you learn to do it, and at first it's difficult and maybe confusing.
Yeah.
Once you do it, you can just kind of rest, and I understand how this works.
And then they even go on right in the next paragraph there to talk about like how it's not just rote memorization. Like you are actually like learning something, and like that's the imitative stage of the dialectic stage, where like you are just learning, okay, this is the Latin response to that, but then you learn the imitation, and then once that becomes more intuitive, then you learn, oh, there's a different ending on the whatever that Latin word is that means student that I'm not going to try to pronounce. Discipuli, and then domina, and like there's a different and then the salvete versus salve, like there's different endings here, and this is what the endings mean, and or like why they're different, and then you learn the more specifics, but you kind of learn it intuitively first.
Yeah.
And so that's different because why is that different than grammar? Like the movement from imitation to understanding is different. Like it's a different imitation to understanding in grammar than it is in the dialectic stage. But I just kind of realized that it feels the same. Do you see where it's different?
Well, it's the difference, because I learned most of the Latin that I learned, especially the latter half, was through conversation, of getting it out of context. But it said if you learn to imitate at first word, okay, I know something that has domain something, whatever the ending, that word means teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned that, and then over time using it, I can go, wait a second. We say dominus to him, and we say domina to her. And if it's another girl, we still say domina. If it's another man, we still say dominus. That ending means something.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can add on to, it's no longer just repeating words. You're piecing together relationships of things. So I'm now moving past just an understanding of word to more of an idea that can then grow into a greater understanding of relationships between things.
Yeah. The legislator Thomas's Summa demonstrates dialectic is the art of reasoning through the voluminous material encountered in a thorough musical and grammatical education. And so it's like in all of the like geography and history and like poetry and songs and literature that you learn in grammar, you learn those things, and that's kind of more like the art. I mean, these are all language arts, but it's kind of like specifically just like language and how it works. Mm-hmm. And then once you get to the dialectic, then it's like reasoning through all of this stuff. So it's not merely just logic. You're like, it's like learning. It's the reasoning. It's much more reasoning of, reasoning through all of this material that you've gotten. Which that was one thing I realized as I was reading through this, is that these kind of all just follow seamlessly into each other.
Yeah.
Which is way different than when we talked about it before.
Oh yes.
We just like, you have like the grammar stage and it does this thing, and then you have the logic stage and it does this thing. Mm-hmm. But like even like, I mean, just a minute ago when I asked you like what the difference is between the dialectic and the grammar stage, moving from imitation to reason, is because they're so similar.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Like it's much less like they were still connected in the way we phrased it before, but it was like one is followed by two, which naturally leads into three, rather than having like you have this line, this spectrum, which then just goes straight into this line and spectrum, which then goes straight into this line and spectrum. And it's just one spectrum, but you have like these different like kind of like specific parts of it that we've identified as three parts, but it's still like a continuous line almost that just goes straight through.
Yeah.
Which was very interesting. And
that's one thing to me. I like the way they've laid it out better here than the way initially we had reading Dorothy Sayers, because I'm trying to think of where it comes from, but if you have multiple solutions, the simplest one is to be preferred. That's almost how I think of this. Is the Sayers one to me was like, it was a lot of moving from this thing. Okay, we're gonna pick up and move over here, and then pick it up and move it over here again. But this one, almost like when we were talking about quadrivium with Mr. Wilbur, we almost didn't realize he was moving from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4.
Right.
This to me seems much easier to just flow from grammar to then dialectic and then on to rhetoric.
Yeah.
So I mean, rhetoric, when they finally get to rhetoric here, it was actually funny, because a lot of the stuff I remember from high school, like the 5 canons of rhetoric, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot what they were, but yeah, he puts it back in there.
That was actually cool. I don't remember learning that when I took rhetoric. I didn't really pay attention very much. I didn't do any reading when I took rhetoric, and I almost failed the midterm. So I didn't actually learn what the canons were. So this part was very enlightening and interesting to me.
I love the way that they really put it back on Aristotle's rhetoric, which to me I think is the best summation of it that I've heard of all the places that I studied it. But I still remember, and they put it in here, Aristotle's definition of rhetoric is the faculty for discovering the available means of persuasion in reference to any subject whatever.
Yeah, that was dope.
You're basically just learning persuasion of anything, how to say it in a compelling, beautiful way. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter what it is. You're learning how to take any situation. And I love the rules. Unlike like dialectic, there's rules of back and forth. The rules here are a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah.
Because it's not as confined, because your audience may be different, and you have to know who you're talking to.
Right. Like that's part of like the canons, which we should probably like walk through them. Mm-hmm. I have them written down in my notes.
Oh, go with that.
So the first canon is invention, which is like the discovery of arguments. So whatever you're going to be speaking on, then you discover the arguments that go with that thing, which comes from dialectic.
Yep.
It's like you're applying what you've learned in the dialectic stage. And then number 2 is arrangement. So accommodating the parts of discourse with the dynamics of the situation and the needs of the audience. So that's what you were just saying. Like you order it in a way, because if you know that your audience is hostile to this idea versus like they're already accepting of this idea, you're going to order the things that you say differently. You're going to say this before you say this thing, or you're going to say it in this way rather than this other way. And then 3 is style, very similar. You accommodate your register of speech with respect to the dynamics of the situation and needs of the audience. And then that, I've noticed, comes from the musical education from before. And like being able to manipulate the register of your speech well comes from learning songs and singing. And
they said that somewhere, didn't they?
I don't remember them saying it. I had that idea by myself because I am super smart.
All right.
Oh gosh. I don't remember them saying that in the book, but I noticed that because they didn't even like connect these to the dialectic thing. Like it didn't say, and then you get this canon from dialectic. I like connected that once I had the musical idea. I was like, oh, I wonder what other stages of the education are a part of this, because they talk about rhetoric being the culmination of the liberal arts, or like of the trivium, right? And it's like everything that you learned up to this point, it's like wrapping all of it up. And so that's what I thought was cool. You've got like the things you learn in the dialectic, but then you learn the music, and that's how you learn how to like change the register of your voice and like the volume and everything. Crap.
And Caleb left his phone on.
Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah. So number 4 is memory, which is like readily accessible knowledge. Which I think they do like specifically say this is what you learned like in grammar. So all of like the information that you said, you have all this extra, what's the word? Not really tangential knowledge, but like,
I can't think of a word for it.
I can't think of a word for it either, but something
We'll
in there,
for lack of a better term.
All this knowledge around there that then can inform the way that you speak of it, and then delivery, which is skill at speaking well and fittingly, which I would also say probably comes from the grammar, just like having read so much and listened to so much that you just kind of know intuitively how these things work, but then you've also studied specifically like how sentences should be structured.
Yeah. Well, that was even doing rhetoric, like taking a class. I took it 3 different times. Well, each time we would study for a little while. Okay, practically, how do you go about giving a speech that conveys this type of thing or this emotion, or gets the audience to think this way when they might be against you or something. And then after we spent a little time on it, he would go, okay, now here's an example of somebody doing it, whether it was written or usually it was a video somewhere. But we had examples of people succeeding and examples of people failing.
Right.
And we would sit and analyze what went wrong or what went right. So it's still that idea of imitation. You're learning the rules, but then you've still got the imitation aspect of it. You've got to read things. You've got to listen to people talk. What is it about certain people you like listening to and certain people that you don't like listening to? Or even if you like listening to them, about their appearance as they deliver the speech. What is it about that goes against what they're saying? And so you have to learn to still imitate what people are doing.
Right. Yeah. And then one last thing before we wrap up. At the beginning, they talked about Aristotle's definition of man being like a rational animal, but kind of like retranslating that almost to be more specific and not have the connotations that we have with the words rational and animal. And they retranslated it to like a living being that has language. And I thought that was super cool.
It's funny because I'm so used to just using that because we talked about it so much.
Really?
I'm used to just what he means by that.
Oh well, yeah.
But
well, yes.
I was like, oh yeah, I guess we are switching meanings of a word here. Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah. And like I knew generally, like obviously, like it's not like scientific meaning of an animal,
Yeah.
right? But I never thought about it in that way, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah,
And like the
that
way that
was
he
helpful.
means, like it means like not language as in just like mere communicating, but like defining humans as being living beings that have language. Like we have language and we're going to be using language regardless of whether or not we're educated. And so the trivium is like training in the good use of that, like, which makes us human, really. And training us in using that in ways that is much more harmonious and beautiful than otherwise.
Yeah, and I love kind of going back to from the beginning of this whole discussion, the idea of being image bearers and God creating with His Word. I love this quote they pulled up by C.S. Lewis here. They pulled it from his essay "Learning in Wartime," where he says he basically says that speech is the power to create worlds. It is not simply that we lead people with our words, or our words are creative. A promise pledged to a friend, for example, or the words "I thee wed," bring about realities that were not present before the words were spoken. Our words also create new realms of possibility within which people can act or think, experience, or feel. An encouraging word can truly carry one through its times of struggle, just as a discouraging word can do the opposite. But the idea of it's not just, well, look, I can say things that are nice now, but they're, again, really thinking the idea of sub-creation with words. And Tolkien, in his essay on fairy stories, he said fairy story, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says fairy story is important. It's creating worlds of fantasy and things like that. It's an act of imitating God in a sub-creator way. You're thinking His thoughts almost after Him, as he created things with words. So we are creating stories and places with our words.
Yeah.
Not to the extent obviously He is, but the idea of words, they're not meaningless. Words have meaning. So studying these language arts, I would argue to speak is a large part of what makes us in the image of God.
Yeah.
And so studying these language arts is learning to use the faculties He has given you in a way that best replicates Him and gives honor to Him.
Yeah.
I would think would be the point of this.
Yeah. And like you learn what the things actually mean, because words do have meaning, like you said, and you study the meanings and you study how to work through different meanings to see which ones are actually in accord with God, and then learning how to present those to other people.
Yeah.
Because that's also, I mean, like, what would language be for if it wasn't for presenting things to other people, right? So, yeah. That was a pretty good quote to bring back for the summary at the end.
Yeah, I loved that quote.
Yeah, that was a really good quote. So we're out of time. We kind of ran a little bit over time. Maybe, I don't know how much we're going to edit out of this. But
thank you for sticking around if you listen to all of our ramblings.
Next time we'll talk about the quadrivium. And
also, before we go, just a reminder, we do have our blog up. It's the Cave Escape blog. You can Google us and find us with the first ones that pop up. But we will weekly, if you haven't been following us, we'll post updates on there, kind of giving a brief summary or sometimes an outline of the episode. And there's comments there. You're welcome to also go. There's comments on YouTube and places as well. But if you go to the blog, we will certainly read it there. And if you have any questions on something, if something didn't make sense, if we did a poor job explaining it, let us know. We want to explain it. If you have a bone to pick with us, let us know that too.
Yeah.
We'd be interested to, because as we've tried to show today, our thinking on some of this has changed even in the couple weeks we've been doing this.
Yeah.
So this is us wanting to put out things that we're thinking about and grow as well. So if you have any feedback, positive, negative, neutral, feel free to go on over there, leave a comment of some kind, and we want to know. But if you've made it this far, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you. I guess we'll see you next time. Until then, take care.